Frank Sinatra spent 50 years talking about music. He gave hundreds of interviews, named dozens of influences, spoke at length and with considerable precision about phrasing and timing and the technical architecture of what made a vocal performance work. He was, among other things, one of the most articulate people in the history of American popular music on the subject of what a voice could do and why it mattered. But there was one night he almost never described in detail. Everyone who knew him well, musicians who had worked alongside him for decades, journalists who had covered him across 2 generations, the small circle of people he trusted with the parts of himself he didn't normally show, agreed that this night existed. They disagreed on when it had happened exactly, on which city it was in, on the specific song being played when the moment arrived. But they agreed that something had taken place, early in Sinatra's career, that he carried differently than the rest of his influences, something he returned to in private, without always being willing to say what it was. The name he returned to was Louis Armstrong. By the early 1940s, Frank Sinatra was becoming something that American popular music hadn't quite seen before, not simply a successful singer, but a phenomenon. The response to him among audiences had a quality that music critics of the era found genuinely difficult to account for. He wasn't simply popular. He was, for a significant portion of the American public, necessary in some way that went beyond entertainment, a voice that seemed to address something personal in whoever was listening, rather than simply providing them with a well-made product. Sinatra understood this intuitively, and he understood it in specifically musical terms. He had come up through the big band era, had worked as a vocalist for Harry James and then Tommy Dorsey, and had absorbed from Dorsey's trombone playing a lesson about breath control and legato phrasing that he would describe in interviews for the rest of his life. He was a musician's singer, someone who approached a lyric the way an instrumentalist approached a melody, with careful attention to where a phrase began, where it needed to breathe, where it resolved. What Sinatra was building in those early years was a theory. He absorbed everything around him with the appetite of someone who knew he was still assembling something. The phrasing of Billie Holiday, whose approach to a lyric he studied with genuine admiration. The breath control of Dorsey. The ease of Bing Crosby, who had shown the previous generation what it meant to inhabit a microphone rather than simply project into it. He was, by every account from those who worked with him during this period, one of the most voracious listeners in the business, someone who heard other performers not as competition, but as evidence of what was possible when a voice was used with complete intelligence and complete intention. And yet, for all of that, there was something missing from the picture he was constructing, a lesson he hadn't yet received in the form that would make it impossible to ignore. He could not have named what was missing, because you can't name something you haven't yet encountered. Louis Armstrong, by the same period, had passed through the phase of his career in which his innovations were actively being made, and was now in the phase in which those innovations had become the ground everyone else was building on, whether they knew it or not, whether they could trace the line of influence or simply felt it without knowing where it had come from. The trumpet playing was what critics discussed when they tried to explain what Armstrong had contributed. But the voice, the rough, warm, slightly worn instrument that had accompanied that trumpet across 3 decades of recordings, was doing something that operated at a different level, and was, in some ways, harder to explain precisely because it violated so many of the things that vocal training at the time held to be important. It wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. It bent notes the way his trumpet bent notes, treated a melody as a suggestion rather than a fixed path, arrived at the emotional center of a lyric through a kind of excavation, finding what was true in a song by moving around it from unexpected angles until the truth surfaced. What that voice was demonstrating, without anyone having quite articulated it yet, was that a great vocal performance was not primarily about the production of beautiful sound. It was about the delivery of something real. The roughness, the warmth, the quality of directness that made Armstrong's singing feel like something being communicated rather than performed. These were not flaws to be tolerated alongside the genius. They were the genius, doing exactly what it needed to do. Sinatra, who was in the middle of constructing his own theory about what a voice should accomplish, had not yet received this lesson in a form he couldn't set aside. He had heard the records. He knew the name. He had, in the casual way that musicians absorb each other's work without fully stopping to examine it, formed an opinion about what Armstrong was. The opinion was about to change. The accounts of the night in question place it at different points in the early 1940s, in different rooms, in different cities. New York is mentioned most often. What they agree on is the shape. Sinatra went to hear Armstrong perform, not as a professional obligation and not because anyone had directed him to, but out of something closer to genuine curiosity. The curiosity of someone who has heard the records and formed a view and wants to test it against the actual thing. He had not come expecting to be surprised. The room was the kind of room Armstrong had spent his career filling, a jazz club or ballroom, the particular address varying depending on whose memory you trust, but the atmosphere consistent across every telling. Loud with conversation before the music started, and then quiet in a way that was different from the absence of noise. The specific quiet of a room that has oriented itself around a single point of attention. What Sinatra heard once Armstrong began was something that the recordings he already knew could not fully prepare him for. The records were accurate in the sense that they captured what Armstrong played and sang. What they couldn't capture was the physical presence of the sound in a room, the way the trumpet moved through the air above the audience, the way Armstrong's voice arrived at each person, as though the distance between the stage and the listener had simply been set aside as a technicality. And there was something else, the quality that those who saw Armstrong live always reached for when explaining why recordings, however extraordinary, were only partial evidence. He wasn't performing at an audience. He was performing with one, reading the room, finding in each crowd the version of the music that the crowd was calling for, adjusting in real time in ways so subtle that no individual in the audience could have identified them, but that the room as a whole could feel. It was, in the terms that Sinatra had been developing for several years, the highest possible expression of what a performer could do in a room full of people, not the delivery of a prepared product to a waiting crowd. Something closer to a conversation in which both sides were participating. Sinatra watched. Those who claimed to have been near him said he was still in a way that was unusual. He was, ordinarily, a man with real-time opinions about whatever he was watching, expressed to whoever was nearby. That night, most accounts agree, he simply observed. At some point during the performance, the specific song not agreed upon, Armstrong sang something that produced in Sinatra an expression that those close enough to see described as neither excitement nor simple pleasure, something more interior, the expression of someone in the middle of quietly rearranging a category, of an assumption being revised without drama, but also without the possibility of being reversed. What Armstrong had done was not show Sinatra a technique. He had shown him a destination, not what to do with his voice, but what the voice was ultimately for, not the production of a sound, however perfect, but the delivery of something true. The distinction sounds simple. In practice, it reorganizes everything. Every technical decision a singer makes, where to breathe, how long to hold a note, how to approach a word that carries more weight than the surrounding ones, looks entirely different depending on whether you understand your voice as an instrument producing output or as a vehicle for something that needs to arrive intact. Sinatra already knew everything Armstrong was doing on a technical level. What he hadn't known, until that night, was why Armstrong was doing all of it, and why it landed the way it did. He didn't speak extensively about the night in the interviews that survived from the years that followed. Not because the admiration wasn't there, it was, and it appeared consistently across decades, in the kinds of careful and specific statements that don't come from politeness or obligation. He called Armstrong the beginning and the end of music in America. He said in an interview given late in his career that there was no American popular singing after a certain point that didn't owe something, consciously or not, to what Armstrong had demonstrated first about what a voice was for. These were not diplomatic gestures. They were the statements of someone describing a personal debt they had never fully discharged. The silence around the specific night was its own kind of evidence. Sinatra could explain what Holiday had shown him. He could explain what Dorsey had shown him. These were lessons, transferable, describable, reducible to a principle that could be passed on in words. What Armstrong had shown him was something that resisted that reduction. It wasn't a lesson in the sense that a lesson is a thing you receive and then carry forward and apply. It was a standard, the clearest possible version of what all the effort was supposed to be in service of. And standards are harder to talk about because they don't operate at the level of what you do. They operate at the level of what everything you do is for. Those who have studied both careers carefully point to the quality in Sinatra's vocal style that critics identified as most distinctly his, the willingness to arrive at a lyric slightly ahead of or behind where the beat would seem to require it, the use of silence as an active musical element, the sense that a song was being spoken to someone rather than performed at them, and note, without either man ever having stated it directly, how clearly it traces back to what Armstrong had been doing first and longest. The music made the connection that neither of them needed to put into words. Sinatra outlived Armstrong by nearly 3 decades. In all the interviews and performances and conversations that filled those years, he returned to the name regularly, not with the slightly mechanical consistency of someone keeping up an obligation, but with the particular quality of someone who has never quite finished thinking about a thing. The admiration didn't calcify into tribute. It stayed alive. Those who worked most closely with Sinatra during his later career said that when Armstrong's name came up, in conversation, in the middle of a rehearsal, in the quiet that sometimes followed a difficult run-through of a song that wasn't landing yet, Sinatra would say something brief and then go quiet again, in the way people go quiet when the thing they are trying to say is larger than the words currently available to them. Frank Sinatra spent 50 years talking about music. He was one of the most precise and self-aware people in the industry about what made a voice work and why. He described in more detail than most performers ever have the technical and emotional architecture of a great performance. But there was one night he almost never described, not because it hadn't mattered, because it had mattered more than anything else, because some things are too close to the center of what you became to reduce to an anecdote. Some experiences don't turn into stories. They turn into the standard by which everything that comes after is measured. Louis Armstrong, on a night somewhere in the early 1940s, in a room that most of the people in it would eventually forget, gave Frank Sinatra the clearest possible understanding of what a voice was actually for. Sinatra spent the rest of his career trying to be worthy of it. He never said that directly. He didn't need to. Anyone who has heard them both already knows